I think from all that we've heard this morning, we don't really need to make a case about the significance of these consecutive G20 presidencies, their role in a shifting world order, their models of governance. I think there is sort of enough evidence, as also our submission in this ORF GHS paper, that this set of 4 emerging economies are actually giving us a really opportune moment to craft what many have called this sort of a fairer, a more just, a more distinct, and possibly a more equitable agenda. And I think an agenda that's sort of based on the issues and challenges that this part of the world sees for itself. So thank you everybody for joining us. Indra has already done the kind introductions. So I'll jump straight in. And Mr. Bhushan, perhaps I'll come to you first with your permission. I remember the day the Prime Minister handed over the ceremonial gavel to President Lula. He articulated what were some of the nuggets of what could be Brazil's priorities. He spoke about just energy transition. He spoke about multilateral bank reforms. He spoke about taking the G20 of Brazil to G20 to many cities in Brazil. India, in a sense, has already crafted a fairly strong pathway of climate priorities. And in most quarters, people are looking towards Brazil to take on that mantle very, very strongly. My question to you is simple. What do you believe are the things that Brazil could, should run with, and where will they bring their own distinct signature?
Thank you, Anubha, and thank you, ORF, for inviting me to this interesting conversation. Let me start by saying that if you look at the leaders' declaration of G20, and let's take the last 10 last G20 presidencies, you will find that 80% of the text is the same. Okay? Countries need 20% priorities. So there is continuity, whether it is on women's issue, on growth, poverty, and you can go back from the first G20 actually, before when it reached the leadership level. So continuity is there, and India has done that with Indonesia on energy transition, absolutely. Now, if you look at Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, there is some trend that is emerging right now. 3 of these countries are coal-dependent economies: Indonesia, South Africa, and India. They account for about 20% of global, 20-25% of global coal consumption. All 4 countries are forest-dependent economies. We account for about 20% of global forest cover. And forest and biodiversity is an important topic for all of us. We all want to become an emerging, from an emerging economy, we want to become a developed economy. Now, the common theme that is important to understand is that we not only need stable geopolitics, also need a stable climate system. Now think about what has happened in Sikkim. Extreme rainfall, 1 dam burst, and Sikkim would have lost about 3 years of its GDP. The dam itself was 14,000 crore rupees, but the kind of infrastructure loss that has happened, it will take years for Sikkim to go back to original status. Now, so for us to move from an emerging economy to a developed economy will require a stable climatic and planetary system. I'm coming from Nairobi. In fact, I reached yesterday from a Montreal Protocol meeting. It's crazy the kind of discussion that is happening at the international platform. You have companies who are selling something called as cool credits to put aerosols in stratosphere to cool the planet. So from being a crazy technology 10 years back, these are becoming reality. And therefore the need for more global governance. If private sector and Silicon Valley companies are interested in, putting things in stratosphere to reflect sunlight and sell it as a carbon credit or cool credit, you require more global governance. So one of the issue which India has taken up on reforming the global governance is more important now than ever, simply because with the kind of environmental challenges we all have, it's not only about climate change. We are on tipping point on forest and biodiversity. Hungatunga volcano that happened last year, I don't know how many of you have heard about it. The last year Hungatunga volcano has created bigger ozone hole this year than ever before. So it is not only anthropogenic activity that is creating planetary problem. We also have natural disasters. And these affect our climatic system. So on many environmental front we are hitting the tipping point. We need more global governance, not less. We need a stable geopolitics and we need stable systems for all of us to grow.
Can I just push the point of what do you believe Brazil can then take forward from all that India has put forward? Quickly.
I think Brazil priority should be forestry. Brazil has, I mean, so Amazonia is the centerpiece of moderating climate system in the world. The challenge is that from being the biggest sink for carbon, our forests could convert into biggest source of carbon. We are seeing that with forest fire. Forest fire in California, it would have, this last year would have emitted about 300 million tons of carbon dioxide emission, carbon dioxide equivalent emission. And while it is a tricky issue for Brazil, but I think Brazil should take this leadership seriously and push forward for a much better and stronger global governance on forest and biodiversity issues.
Fair enough. I think it's important to say that the purpose of this panel is actually to try and formulate what that continuity could look like. What are the contours of that continuity? What are the frameworks and the low-hanging fruit we could work with as we are handing over the baton to Brazil and South Africa? Dr. Soumya, this sort of interconnectedness between climate change, planetary health, public health, add in digital health, the larger digital public infrastructure. I mean, I think that interconnectedness is very well embraced, but sometimes all of working on everything can also mean working on nothing, right? I think our experiences from COVID-19 have sort of also meant that there is a breakdown of that trust. India has laid out some of the priority areas. What do you believe are the stronger pointers of collaboration as we are now transitioning to Brazil and then later to South Africa?
Thank you, and thanks again to GHS and ORF for inviting me to share my thoughts. And since you mentioned the pandemic, maybe we can start with some of the lessons from the pandemic in terms of the inequities that we observed. And these inequities, we could start with diagnostics. I think a lot of people overlook diagnostics, but essentially there are many countries, or most countries, where you don't have the diagnostics available, and therefore you have no idea about what diseases exist and what the disease burden is. And many people believe that their countries were not affected that much by COVID, but because there were no diagnostics, there were no people being diagnosed. And this applies to many other diseases, including, TB and a lot of the vector-borne diseases now that are increasing, as well as diagnostics for non-communicable diseases. So I think this has been a neglected part of universal health coverage agenda and primary health care, and I think more focus on developing, like the world was able to develop point of care diagnostics so quickly for COVID. I think we would do well perhaps to again come together, and again these are mainly the gaps of low and middle income countries. Then we saw inequities in research and development. So much financing was put into the development of countermeasures in the high income countries, and a tiny proportion of funding actually came to companies in the Global South. And we have something called the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. And if you look at the overall funding that went into vaccine development, which actually is over $100 billion, only less than 5% of that came to all of the companies in the developing country vaccine network. And if more had come, and it had come earlier, perhaps we would have had more vaccines available earlier so that the global needs could have been met. So I think this collaboration on R&D, and so again it's not just for public health but also for technologies needed for addressing climate issues. How do you develop technologies for public good rather than for private profit? So I think Brazil, India, South Africa have all been champions. In fact, India and South Africa went to the WTO and asked for a waiver on IP on vaccines for COVID, and of course did not succeed. but I think the message is that we need to be thinking of a new way of doing R&D, especially when it comes to developing goods what are for public good. Then of course the manufacturing also needs to be looked into, and while there are vaccine manufacturers in the global south, the African continent in fact does not have any vaccine manufacturing capability, and that needs to change, because I think what we saw was that there are issues that relate to national needs which prevent actually these products from going out of the country's borders, and therefore not every country needs to set up obviously vaccine manufacturing, but there has to be some regional arrangements like the Africa Union has done with a roadmap, to expand the manufacturing capacity on the continent and be able to supply at least 60% of their vaccine needs by 2040, But this requires financing, it requires a lot of technology transfer, it requires training of people with different types of skills. So there's a whole agenda there that will address the equity issues, but there are many verticals which would need to be addressed. And then I think on financing, again we've seen the pandemic fund that's been set up. A very small percentage of what was promised has been has found its way into the fund. Similarly, the $100 billion per annum we heard, for climate adaptation and mitigation, that is not forthcoming. So I think unless more financing comes into public health, primary health care in particular, I think these issues, the health is going to be one of the biggest negative, outcomes of climate change. We're going to see not only heat impacts, but on vector-borne diseases, but also through agriculture and the impact on food systems. We're going to see big impacts on nutrition. So in almost all ways, and of course the next pandemic could also arise at any time due to biodiversity loss, urbanization and climate change. And therefore I think keeping people's health as a primary goal would be a good way also to start looking at what can you do which will be a core benefit for climate change. And I'll give you one last example perhaps, and that's air pollution. I think the air pollution today, we know from WHO data that 95% of people globally live in areas of the world which do not have air quality that meets the WHO standards. That means almost all of us are living, some in more polluted, some in less polluted, but mostly that's a developing world again that's seeing the brunt of air pollution, and therefore addressing the drivers of air pollution will also help climate change. And again, it's a very, we know that by addressing air pollution and reducing PM 2.5 and other pollutants, that you can see immediate impacts on health. Heart attacks go down, strokes go down. So this is a very good thing, I think, for the future G20 presidencies to focus on.
I think you've opened so many threads that we could actually have a G20 focused on global public health and then digital public goods. I actually wanted to do a round of questions on the heart of this, right? It's really good to say that we want a just, a more fairer, a more equitable world. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof of the pudding is in the money and the finance. So I'll do that round maybe at the end once I'll come to Mr. Gupta. I think Dr. Soumya mentioned digital public goods. It's sort of been the heart, the digital public infrastructure has been the heart of India's G20 agenda. I know you've spoken a lot about that. We've already shown this. We've already shown the India stack. We've done this at scale. We've done this at our population level. But how do you truly see DPIs actually being further expanded in the Global South with the next two presidencies?
Yeah, thank you. I think the proof of the pudding is in eating it, right? And as Dr. Soumya just said it. And this is what we did during our G20 summit in India. We made technology which was being espoused by a few globally, actually being experienced over the last 1 year by the delegates, not only just the head of states, but over the course of the year. We have seen delegates queue up and make a payment on the unified payments interface, the UPI. We have seen delegates go to a ration distribution shop and see a what is called the direct benefits transfer, the PDS transaction take place online live. So we basically made it a look and feel, touch and feel of technology, because technology, unfortunately, before the India's G20 presidency was, again, everybody was saying, yes, this is good, India has done it, World Bank was talking about it, everybody was talking about it. But, unless you see what this phenomena is, you were not able to appreciate the importance of it. So when the digital minister from Germany went and bought a 10 rupee vegetable at a corner shop, that made them realize the power of doing a small transaction. And I think that, and to take it to a discussion of continuity. So what India did is it created, what we have benefited over the last 8 to 9 years, the DPI, and I want to make a few discussions on that because United Nations was mentioned a lot. Interestingly, United Nations has now contributed, and I've been on that committee where we basically define what is a DPI. So UN has also taken an interest in understanding how the DPIs can really further the developmental agenda, number one. So it's in everybody's lexicon. Two, during, as Dr. Soumya mentioned, during the COVID pandemic, and apart from giving, and I think the High Commissioner from the Ambassador from South Africa mentioned it, that India shared its vaccines, but we also shared our platform. The CoWIN platform, which is now a universal health platform in India, the ABDM, is also a digital public good, and that was also shared with many countries. It was open source. So we showed the path that we can actually give technology without the IP rights. Not only, and we of course talked about for the actual vaccine, but also as far as I'm concerned, for the digital platforms, we showed a path how it can be given to people without any bells and whistles, and how it can be used and co-created for their own purposes in their own country. So that's the second thing, and many countries benefited from that also, that little limited aspect of it. And thirdly, what we did during this whole G20 thing, and why it is becoming a continuous thing, whether it's for Brazil or for other countries, is that we have made it a bottom-up movement, especially when it comes to digital. Means when people have experienced it during the B20s, the Business 20 came and saw, the Think 20s came and saw, the startups saw it, and they said, hey, we've just created a new startup culture because of this digital public infrastructure, which is a non-rent seeking way of building technology. So, today, all the sections of the society which came during different parts of the G20 presidency, whether it was businesses, society, the governments, and the finance ministries, they all said that there is, for example, benefits of the tax buoyancy, formalization of the economy that we have seen, preserving revenue and making directed benefits for the government. So every part of the constituency, if you may, saw benefit for themselves. And I think that is what has given up, at least on the digital front, a continuity. That it's a bottom-up thing. Everybody, the citizens, the startups are asking their own leaders that why can't we implement this model in our country?
And one could say, or one could make that argument, that India perhaps has a slightly more pronounced role in making sure that that continuity goes on. I just want to add sort of one pragmatic bit. I know India in its G20 brought on lots of discussions about data privacy, about surveillance, about the protection of data of our citizens, and sometimes many of these have been very valid concerns that we've had towards the West. As we go about expanding the digital public infrastructure, it could be said that many of our friends in the Global South, as well as beyond, who choose to come and use some of the tools of this digital public infrastructure, could also turn back and sort of talk about some of this. Where do you believe are the safeguards that we have put in expanding this?
Now, Anubha, that is the fundamental to DPIs. It is not a technology that gets controlled from either the Silicon Valley, I worked there 27 years, or from the Shenzhen Valley. When we share, technology, we share it in the tour spirit. We don't have backdoors and bells and whistles, and we actually give the power for the country, the society to co-create it, own it, and control it. Of course, within their systems, they will need to have the personal data protection laws, they will need to, and that is also part of the learnings that we share. We don't just share technology, we share the processes, the use cases, how we have implemented, where it has benefited, and also the policy changes that are required to make it happen. So, but I have to make it very categorical. When India gives its technology, there are two ways. One, we share technology. One, we build a network, right? A network is required for global payments per se. But when we share technology, it's not that we saying the server is sitting in India and you are just giving you an instance of that. I'm not going to get too technical on this. We share technology in the true spirit, which means we give you, as I said, open source the code, and you can develop on top of it for your local needs, for your languages, for whatever else you need. So categorically, India is very different from the other world of developed technology. This is technology genuinely as an open source public good.
And that's why I think even when it comes to digital health, we are now increasingly calling them or putting them under the umbrella of digital public goods. I want to do one round before I open it up to the audience on sort of the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It's sort of the elephant in the room. We may want to build this fairer, more equitable world. India has taken a lead. I know Brazil's spoken about reform of multilateral development banks. These are some uncomfortable conversations, but they have started. How do we move forward on them? India has taken a big role so far, but these conversations are now happening with far more continuity and far more frequency, I beg your pardon.
So I think there is some level of transparency and honesty required in classifying the world. Okay, we have classified the world as it was post Second World War. Okay, that's not the reality. Today, if China calls itself a developing country and says that developed countries should pay to China, then that's a problem. Okay, because China also has $1 trillion BRI scheme, Belt and Road scheme, where it is investing. I'm saying it because I've just witnessed a discussion at the Montreal Protocol, where some of the countries said that we need to change the definition of countries in the annexure. Because 80% of all the money that goes to developing country today goes to China, because China is the largest producer of refrigerants. 80% of world refrigerant is produced by China. So the support that developed countries have to give to developing countries, the bulk of it goes to China. Okay. So the global finance debate also is a debate on the current reality of the world. Somehow we are not trying to address that. Middle East, for example. Okay. Some of the Middle East countries per capita income is more than any other developed countries. Do we want to address that issue? So as I said, some amount of transparency and honesty is required in looking at the world of 21st century that we are not doing. The second issue is, I do not believe that developed countries are going to give us grant ever. Okay. 30 years of climate finance debate shows us that they've never given us money. And therefore, instead of asking for money, I think the requirement is to reform the global financial market, which is not working for the Global South. An African country pays 4 times more interest on global capital than a developed world. Okay. So instead of asking money, we just say that reform the global finance system. It is more than enough for us to solve our problem. Okay, because we are paying just too much. In fact, there is outflow of money from developing countries to developed world in terms of interest repayment. Okay, they are not giving us; we are actually financing them. So that would be a much more important agenda to pursue.
I think the High Commissioner from South Africa mentioned that very well. Dr. Soumya, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think we also have to think of how we can create the South-South networks to generate knowledge and technologies which are relevant for us, which are more likely to be affordable, which from the very beginning we build equity into the process of R&D, where unlike in the past where the products which are developed are shared or under voluntary licensing or they are under patent protection, here right from the beginning, I think the new model of R&D that we're looking at, again focused on development of public goods, would be that even during the process of innovation, you have the equity built in where you're actually sharing technology. So what happened when I was at the WHO was that, we saw the inequities in the access to vaccines, and we set up the mRNA technology transfer program. In fact, the hub is in South Africa, and there are 16 spokes around the world, all in LMICs. The idea is that scientists in these countries are perfectly capable of developing the technology. We don't have to wait for it to trickle down. Of course, it takes time, but with collaboration and with some financing, it can be done. And today what has happened is that there's a very vibrant network of scientists across these 16 countries using mRNA platforms to develop a range of products, not just COVID vaccines that we have enough of anyway. So I think it's that kind of model that we need to see, and it was, I think, brought up during the Indonesian presidency. The discussions continued during the Indian presidency, and I hope that Brazil would take it one step forward, because again, all of these countries do have strong R&D networks and institutions, and with the government investing more in research, again, that needs to go up. So the financing for R&D definitely needs to go up, because innovation, for it to really happen at a fast pace, needs that kind of funding, and the private sector needs the government to come up with some amount of the risk. They need to bear some of the risk, because innovation is a risky process, and not all things that are started are going to be successful. Only 1 in 10 vaccines actually end up being successful. So the government has to step in there really to take the risk. But again, then we can direct the R&D towards our priorities, and instead of going for very expensive drugs for obesity, which that's what the big multinational companies are working on now. They're not working on a TB vaccine. We need to work on a TB vaccine, because the bulk of TB is in the G20 countries.
I mean, these are all high burden diseases, TB, malaria, the NTDs, and they all sort of sit on this side of the world. So obviously our priorities are those. I'll open it up for one round of questions, and possibly we'll do a closing where all of you could delve with. I think some of the experts we spoke to while writing out this report said this could be a different regional blocking to build in the continuity. We could revive some of the old blocks. I know everybody likes quads, so there could be a G20 quad for this, or an IBSA could become an IBSA or something like that. So we'll leave that as a final round as to what could this regional frameworks or continuity look like. But if there are any questions in the audience, you could just raise your hands and the mic could come to you. Yeah, we could take that one first.
Sir, my question is like that. Sir, you are talking about the DPI. So we are investing only private sector investing $10 billion, and the China is investing $200 billion. So we are going for a democratization process that, and the corporate sector is not going to make profit. That is the reason they are not investing in it. So how we can increase the investment in DPI from the private sector? That's my question.
Do you want to take that?
First of all, your numbers are wrong. Secondly, no, I'll tell you why. I'm not saying your number. Anything that comes from China, I don't believe ever. Number one. Two, and that's my personal view. And two is the whole intent of DPIs is non-rent seeking, but technology companies are using it, right? I mean, let me give you an example live that is going on. And this is again, the question he has asked is, are we putting enough investments into the DPI infrastructure? And my contention is two things. Number one, DPIs don't require the kind of investment that private tech platforms require. Because, for example, in India, we have built Aadhaar, which is now 1.3 billion people at a cost of less than $2 per person, $2.5 billion. Aadhaar has saved India in savings itself $45 billion. It has paid for itself in 1 year. It's going to keep paying for the next 10 years or maybe more. So number one, that's the first contention. Two, and we are building something called a new DPI called ONDC. This is a open network for digital commerce. We went from identity, UPI, now we are building a digital infrastructure for e-commerce called ONDC. ONDC is probably going to be built, give or take. I can't give out specifics because it's still in the build stage, but probably what is ONDC going to spend $200 million to reach a level that a big tech company, e-commerce vendor that you and me, all of us use, is probably going to spend $2 billion in going to the Indian market. They probably spent half of it already. So the cost structure that is there in digital public infrastructure is also frugality by design. It's a very frugal innovation. So you don't need, so never compare a $10 billion investment in DPI vis-a-vis whatever numbers that some other company gives you, because that's mostly being spent in market outreach. It's not being built for technology. We'll discuss this later on.
Let's get another question in, and I request you if we keep it sort of broadly under the umbrella of what we are discussing. We could go on with digital public goods separately as well. There was a question here. We could get the mic. Could we have the mic for that lady?
Thank you. So I just wanted to follow up on the point about knowledge networks and platforms. So why haven't they happened within the countries in the Global South? Why isn't this knowledge exchange and stuff happening as much as it should? And how can we make it happen more in the future? Yeah.
You're addressing this question in which?
To, I guess,
Dr. Soumya.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good question. I mean, why hasn't it happened in the past? I'm not sure. I think there have been good intentions, because I know in the BRICS, for example, there's been a lot of discussion on developing these networks and platforms for doing, especially on the health side, clinical trials and so on. But I think there are a lot of rules and regulations, national rules and regulations, which somehow seem to not facilitate that type of work. So I think the pandemic actually facilitated. So the pandemic actually broke many rules, and people were willing to share, willing to not wait for their publications. They didn't want personal credit. They were working in mission mode, and scientists all over the world dropped what they were doing and started focusing on COVID with trying to help humanity at large. And so I think when there's a common mission and a goal, everyone came together, and I witnessed that firsthand, the kind of sharing that people were actually willing to do, except of course, for some of the big multinational companies which were not so forthcoming. But otherwise, scientists working across the board were, you need the funding, you need a goal, you need a common mission, but also you need governance. And I think this was mentioned earlier about global governance being very important. And the WTO was mentioned earlier, also during the previous panel discussion, and how the WTO did not facilitate this. And so whether it's for climate issues, whether it's for trade during the pandemic, the trade rules need to change. They need to be very different than what you may have during peacetime. So the WTO also needs to look at, in the new era in which we are living, where there are threats to public health, where there's climate change, those old trade rules that were negotiated some time ago. And despite the fact that yes, there are TRIPS flexibilities, those flexibilities are hardly used by developing world, and for reasons that we all know. And the last point I would mention is on regulation. Regulatory bodies in every country also have their own rules, and this often comes in the way actually of collaboration. So I think again, developing regional networks. During the pandemic, we saw medicine regulators from around the world come and sit together and say, how do we fast track these products? We've never done it before. And so new ways of working were actually developed. We should not go back to the old ways of working now. How do we actually promote innovation in the Global South by making our regulatory agencies also more nimble and efficient and collaborative?
Can you get the mic? I'll get the mic to the gentleman first and then to Anjali. Sorry about that. Apologies for that.
The gentleman talked about climate finance, that for last 30 years we have not made much headway on that. And we know that the restructuring of the financial institution is not an easy task to be achieved. It's very challenging. So I just want to ask you, sir, what is the life of the planet for the survival of the human beings? We know that the climate finance cannot come, the amount of money which is required. Even in the G20, we have made a commitment of, say, $100 billion by 2025. That's not sufficient at all.
I'm not going to comment on the life of humans or the planet. I do understand that the current geopolitics should be at least for us surviving next century. Yeah, that at least we should do. But let me be serious about it. Actually, if you look at from the percentage of GDP that is required to solve the climate crisis, it is not much. It's about 3%. So if we take global GDP at about say 80 to 90 trillion dollar, the entire energy transition, by the way, energy sector is only about 5% of global GDP. All this discussion about how big and important an energy sector is only about 5% of GDP. And it requires 3% of GDP to transform it for the next 30 years. So if every country decides to put 3% of GDP, the problem is solved. I'm trying to simplify it, but I'm just giving you a sense about how much money is required. Out of 100 rupees, we need only 3 rupees to solve climate crisis. Currently, we are putting actually 30 paisa. Okay? So it's not a lot of money. If we want to do it, we can do it. In fact, we spend more money on arm industry than we are putting for climate crisis. The global arm industry is close to 2.5% of GDP. So for all of us here, it is important to decide whether we want to spend killing each other or saving the planet. That's the choice we have. Okay? So it's not about money, frankly speaking. $100 billion is nothing. If we decide within countries to divert money from some of the most environmentally destructive activity to environmentally sound activity, I think we will be able to solve 30-40% of the problem within the countries itself. Okay.
Fair enough. Anjali, do you want to ask your question and then we can wrap it up? Please go ahead. One. Okay. Behind, first you, Anjali, and then we can take it behind you as well.
We've seen fairly good knowledge sharing happening within the African Union, the regional bodies of Africa. ASEAN does a good job. BRICS, as you've mentioned it. G20 is a more diverse group. And it's also the G7 and the developing countries. How do we make knowledge sharing happen there? Because the differences are so extreme.
Yeah, can we take the next question as well and then we can get? Yes.
So,
we'll take
quick question to Mr. Arvind. So you talked about sharing DPIs. So my question is, what challenges might arise when sharing DPI models, and how it can be mitigated?
Challenges of sharing DPI models. I'll take the gentleman there and then you can give the question as well.
Basic question regarding, we are seeing that a lot of divergent policies are coming. For example, EU cries hawks regarding subsidies, from China regarding solar panels and renewable solutions, and we are also seeing CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism also, which is termed as protectionist by a lot of nations. So how can we see that the proper standards are set so that these, sustainability solutions can be equitably, managed? Otherwise, there will be a lot of, what you call, lot of protectionism, lot of going to be restrictions, which is only going to create a lot of conflict in the future rather than accessing solutions. Thanks.
Fair enough.
Hello, I have a question to the Chandra Bhushan sir. We have seen in India, there are so many NGOs which are my question is directly how to balance development with the sustainable development goals.
He can do an entire lecture on that, but thank you for your question. Any more? One more. Yes, sir, please go ahead. I'm just wrapping up all the questions so that we can get the guests to answer it in one go.
My question is, how can G20 countries, which ring the entire world, come together, A, locally for the entire value chain of healthcare sector, and B, for advocacy to prevent, to strengthen global health security, to prevent any spillovers, as Chandra Bhushan says, from anthropogenic activities or natural activities. How can we strengthen the global health security infrastructure?
Thank you so much. Should I go to Arvind first to answer both the question of knowledge sharing as well as the question of challenges to DPI?
So knowledge sharing in general, I think Anjali asked that, at least in the digital domain, is now I can say it's accelerated. There's a continuous dialogue going on with Africa, even before they became part of the G20 as G21. But there is a continuous dialogue going on. There's a lot of knowledge sharing going on, both at the G2G level and the G2, the iSpirit and the, there are multiple bodies in India which are working on making or enabling DPIs in the public-private mode. So there's a lot of knowledge sharing happening across, at least from India, and there's multiple exchanges happening. On the challenges, I think challenges for DPIs are many. The gentleman over here mentioned 200 billion versus 2 billion or 10 billion, whatever the number was. And both those numbers are incorrect, but because of the lot of marketing is built into those numbers. The biggest challenge that comes from the people who into DPIs. There is a challenge that was on the acceptance side, on the leadership understanding, leadership of respective countries understanding what is the value in doing this. Should this be a priority? But two things have happened, of course, things like COVID, things like the geopolitical nature, that the whole discussion on digital sovereignties have really taken priority, also helped digital public goods take priority in their thinking, in their top 5, top 7 thinkings that they need to do. But so that has changed. The first challenge was a mindset challenge that has actually overcome to a large extent. But the second challenge is now it is the challenge where the private companies which are going to get disrupted because of DPIs, and there's I can go on and on, give you examples, a list of examples with each DPI disrupting somebody. That becomes the biggest challenge, because they're highly embedded incumbents, and they put in, as somebody said, a lot of money into the system. They're putting a lot of advocacy and lobbying in many countries. So that is the biggest challenge, believe me, and that confuses lawmakers and policymakers more than anything else.
Okay, but the challenges of embracing it are over. Chandra, Bhushan, do you want to answer the question about standardizing some of the sustainability solutions that came from the far right?
I think the answer again is that, as far as CBAM is concerned, carbon border adjustment that Europe is going to put, I don't think that Global South did its homework very well, because the table can be turned on Europe very quickly. And I'll give you an example why. Global South is building now, and therefore we have access to the most advanced and most efficient technology. Europe built in past. Europe's steel industry is very inefficient compared to modern Indian industry. So we can put a border and let European companies pay us rather than we paying them. So, there is way to deal with CBAM, but ultimately, if you want to deal with carbon in trade, it has to be a global governance. Okay? It cannot be one continent deciding what it wants to do. And I think in countries like India can do its homework well and push the button so that Europe takes this issue at the global level. I believe, there was a question on what do we do in terms of all the problems we are going to face. I have been talking about it in Mahabharata. There is something called as Yudh Viram. Okay. So you give a gap and then go back and fight again. I think we need 20 years of Yudh Viram, because next 20 years is going to be very critical, from climate, biodiversity, education, health, jobs.
That's a lot of wishful thinking.
That's what I'm saying, but next 20 years is going to be the most critical for all of us. 2050 is where every deadline is coming. Okay. And I think the world has to think about what it wants to do in next 20, 30 years. Does it want to continue with the politics of 20th century, or it wants to transition to the new geopolitics of 21st century? I think that's where the debate is.
Okay. I'll give Dr. Soumya. I think you had already said that the old rules don't apply, but possibly it's also a way to answer the question the gentleman said about local regional networks and strengthening them.
So as you know, the world is debating a new pandemic treaty or accord, and in fact by May of 2024 the countries are supposed to agree on that and present it at the World Health Assembly. And it is about, again, how does the world come together, learn the lessons from the pandemic to prevent something like that from happening again, and to address all the inequity issues that we saw, but also to address some of the other things like the trade and travel rules, which were often very unfairly imposed on countries. I think similar to what Chandra Bhushan was saying, that we saw that a country identified a new variant, and announced that the new variant had been found, and immediately, mostly it was high-income countries, they closed their borders and stopped people and goods and other things and caused immense economic damage to those countries. So this is a clear disincentive for transparency and data sharing, that if you get punished actually for sharing the right kind of data. So I think we need that global governance, and that there's an opportunity there in the pandemic accord, but only time will tell how much countries are actually willing to give and take and to change the old rules in favor of a more equitable rules based on equity, based on really helping the most vulnerable. I don't know, because there are obviously a lot of interests there that are at work, and so there's a lot of negotiation still ahead. I think in terms, I just wanted to say in terms of digital, I think there are immense possibilities in health. We've actually realized all of the possibilities of DPI in the financial sector, but I think in the health we still have not realized. And during COVID, we were just scratching the surface. I think we started the eSanjeevani program in India, the telemedicine initiatives, the CoWIN app, but those are just, I think, the surface. We need a lot more research in the digital applications, because again, we do have populations that don't have access, and we need to ensure that going fully into digital doesn't mean that, there's a section of society that gets left out actually of, and we again do not serve everybody and reach everyone. So I think that's the one caveat. And around the world there are countries which, the internet penetration is still very poor. People may have a mobile phone, but they don't have access to the internet. And therefore we need even digital solutions which are still able to be delivered, through existing technologies based on the local context as well, which is again something the Global South can lead on. Thank you.
I'll leave it there. We're we're past our time far, but thank you very much for joining. As we said, we've authored this report, and I think one of the things in this panel at least, and I think in previous panels, it's a sort of foreign policy meets development, but the vocabulary of so much around justness, fairness, equitable, collective action, collective responsibility, makes one feel that we're possibly on the right track. I'll close it here. Thank you very much.